You heard the brief announcement, and so at this point, before Georgine, president of Slovak American Society of Washington, D.C., welcomes the participant. Just from the background, I'm going to say that people are tuning in as I speak, and I think we're ready to start. So over to you, Georgine.
Okay. Dobrý deň, and hello and welcome to the fourth and last program of the Slovakia at 30 speaker series, celebrating 30 years of the Slovak Republic. This series is brought to you by the Friends of Slovakia and by the Slovak American Society of Washington, D.C. I am Georgine Chastain, president of the Slovak American Society of Washington, D.C. Our guest speaker today is Zuzana Wienk, and I will read her bio now. Zuzana Wienk is a former journalist, a writer on current affairs, and a civic activist. She is a co-founder in 2002 and former program director and executive director of Aliancia Fair Play, a Slovak watchdog NGO that encourages civic engagement to promote responsible politics, increase government transparency, support judicial reform, and stamp out corruption. Since 2016, she has been on the steering committee of the initiative Partnerstvo pre otvorenie vládnutia, Open Government Partnership. In 2019, she became the director of the civic association Bystriny, an offshoot of Aliancia Fair Play that connects and supports projects and people active in their community. Before we hear from Zuzana, here is Ambassador Javorcik with a few words.
Thank you, Georgine. I'm apologizing myself for not handling the technology well, so you cannot see me, but I can hear and see loud and clear everybody. I'm so glad that this fourth edition of the chats and the debates about Slovakia at 30 is happening, and is finishing with a topic of civic society in Slovakia, which basically is the fabric of Slovak society after the fall of communist regime. I vividly recall when I joined my civil service, and my first boss, Paolo Demes, was introducing me to many interesting people who had nothing to do with the official government, but were helping to forge the unity of people, unity of purpose for people to understand what is democracy, what are the tools which are employed in democracy, and there is something like a watchdog in a community, which is not necessarily law enforcement, but is coming from grassroots, from people interested in making our community more transparent, more responsible, and more responsive to the needs of politicians and everyday walk of life. And if we look into the 30 years of Slovakia, and Zuzana Wienk is really perfectly placed person to talk about all of those 30 years. But if you look into the main waypoints of Slovak history, the 30 years, it was always the civic society which jumped in. Whether it was the 90s with Vladimir Mečiar, whether it was during the successful coalition governments which brought us to European Union and NATO and other international organizations, it was the civic society which was pushing the government to do correct things. And if we go forward, and also the murder of Jan Kuciak, and before that, murder of Remiáš, it was the civic society which was holding responsible the law enforcement and the government. So I'm so glad that we have this this conversation today, and I'm always willing to listen to Zuzana Wienk and her not anecdotes, her view of the society, how it should be run, how can it be run, and what are the lessons learned for the next generations of Slovaks to rule ourselves more successfully. So with that, I would leave it to the most competent two persons to debate, and looking forward to what it will come out from that. So thank you, Georgine. Thank you, Zuzana. So thank you, Eugene, to be with us today. And I will leave it to Zuzana Wienk to have her intro, and then looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for those extremely kind words, but also the key messages, which I must say that we didn't rehearse together, but they really echo my main points today for the conversation. Many thanks, Georgine, Eugene, for leading this conversation, and Friends of Slovakia for this wonderful invitation. I am really looking forward mainly to a Q&A. So I will kick off with a few remarks from my side, and then hopefully we have a very rich conversation. I totally agree with Mr. Ambassador, and here my journalistic spirit comes in. If I should sum up the story of civil society into the 30 years perspective in a journalistic headline, which I was forced to make many times as a news person, I would really say that the civil society was a backbone for Slovak and European democracy, and overall a huge success. It was an incubator of the key democratic reforms and solutions. It was an incubator for future leaders in many areas of Slovak society, and of necessary innovation. Ambassador has mentioned the key points of Slovak history where the Slovak civil society was really a leader and a motor of the necessary changes. I would just add maybe few that are very recent, and that was the crisis that urgently surprised us, and where the state really shown a low competence to deliver key necessary and quick response, and that was the COVID pandemic and the Ukrainian war, where civil society was really fast to mobilize and was extremely helpful in setting up the frameworks before the state and the municipalities managed to jump in. So I would really say in this headline section that Slovak society really was the key element that helped to uphold our democracy and contributed to the grounding of Slovakia to the West, and up to date still provides services where the Slovak state still remains to be weak or fails to deliver. I would maybe briefly go through two main eras of the civil society development in the last 30 years. The first one would be the rise of civic movement after the communist regime. And as was pointed out in the preparation for this webinar, I really think the true spirit was rooted in the dissident culture before the fall of the communism. But of course, a modernization and democratization of the country required a much larger scale, and that scale had a base at home. Many dissidents were founding fathers and mothers of the key civic movements in Slovakia in the 90s, but the rise and scale wouldn't be possible without international help. And I think it's fair to say that mainly US philanthropic tradition helped to really ground a very vibrant and strong civil society. So when we look back at the 90s, thanks to a very generous systemic and institutional funding coming from the very important foundations grounded in the US, mainly helped to seed very strong institutions, independent institutions that attracted a lot of talent. and that really picked up very quickly the key elements necessary for economical and democratic transition of a country. But in this era, I think what we need to also focus on the buts or on the risks. What we could see was a large dependence of institutions of civil society on foreign sources of funding. There was much less focus on building domestic base and domestic legitimacy and thinking forward and trying to prepare for the times when the funding will have to come mainly from the inner sources. And there was also a little bit smaller contact with various constituencies, especially the constituencies that were away from the capital city or larger cities, and constituencies that were hit by the transition economically and socially, and would be very fragile when talking about supporting democracy and market economy. But the 90s and the beginning of the years of 2000s, I think the civil society was really vibrant, and as ambassador and I already pointed out, they really helped to protect democracy when it was under threat from authoritarianism, and helped to really mobilize civil society behind the necessary grounding of Slovakia in the West through the accession to European Union and NATO. After the accession, I would say a second era of the development of the civil society started, where many main donors, especially US-based, pulled back very logically, believing that the strong economy that was present at the time would be able to seed a new domestic funding with the help of European Union, who would pick up this trend. And really, to a certain extent, we could see a really unprecedented rise of domestic philanthropy. Many corporate foundations were created, many crowdfunding, creative solutions, and initiatives appeared. What we could see now is a much stronger society, especially after the key tests in Slovak history, as was already mentioned, for example, the murders of Jan Kuciak and Martina Kušnírova. The civil society unprecedentedly quickly mobilized, and a very informal network has been created who was able to lead the uprising of Slovak society for months and months on a volunteer basis, really supported by crowdfunding initiatives only. The same happened after the COVID pandemic and the Russian aggression in Ukraine, where main philanthropic efforts were started by leading businessmen and businesswomen in Slovakia, who very quickly put together platforms and infrastructure for reaction and for collecting money. What I would say on the side of the buts here is that the trends are very promising. I think the Slovak civil society understood and lived through their own experience and emancipation that when in crucial moments it comes together, it can really shape the country and democracy. But with the leaving of the main traditional donors, what we can feel more and more is the lack of institutional funding and systemic focus for infrastructure building and social innovations. Most of the corporate foundations and the sources of funding, as I mentioned today, they exist only through the 2% of tax assignation. So the corporate foundations are financed by state money coming from the taxes. And they very much tie the goals of their efforts and to very small short-term projects and activities that are focused on their own corporate priorities. So a lot of areas stay underfunded, especially those ones that require a very systemic long-term support, grassroots connections, and the platform infrastructure is being weaker and weaker, with many leaders leaving civil society for politics and other sectors. The civil society also remains vulnerable. And the last point I would like to make in my opening remarks is maybe a challenge that we share, I believe, with the global world, that the civil society to a big extent was focusing over 30 years on the big picture, on the key structural challenges that Slovakia faced to be able to uphold and root democracy deeper. So it was like fixing legislative frameworks, introducing some very key institutional backbone solutions to the civil society. But as I mentioned, there was less grassroots contact and also unforeseen consequences with this focus on anti-corruption, rule of law, where civil society exposed a lot of structural weaknesses in civil society. But what we haven't realized that this fair criticism and this fair focus was basically feeding and fueling anti-systemic forces in Slovakia that are now in the rise. And there is what I feel as one of the biggest challenges up to date is a very significant split in the society, where a lot of people feel left out from the story of transition. Again, with the economic challenges and the energy crisis and the war in Ukraine being so close to the Slovak borders, many people feel that they are not represented by the civil society. And this is, we can talk about it further, Eugene, if you are interested in that, or if the audience is interested in that, of where I feel that we were partially responsible and what we should do about it. But I would say that we are at a very critical juncture at the moment in Slovakia, where there is a very high distrust in the society. Many polls show a huge vulnerability of the population to disinformation. The Russian propaganda had a really systemic free ride in Slovakia and was able to destabilize the environment. And what we feel, and I think this is the most dangerous aspect, is a very fragmented and destroyed political landscape, where the traditional political parties with internal membership and democratic infrastructure almost disappeared. And after the first 30 years, for the first time, Slovakia faces that the majority of pro-democratic, pro-Western voters are disillusioned, and they are not willing to go to vote, or they don't know who to support at the moment. And we have a very high mobilization of the polls are showing that if we mobilize voters at the moment, it could backfire, because we would most probably add fuel to the already mobilized anti-systemic and populistic forces and very disillusioned parts of the population. So I would end here with the challenges, but don't take it as a doom gloom scenario. I am a person of solutions, but I will leave the room for the discussion maybe here.
Okay, thank you, Zuzana. If the audience has any questions to ask Zuzana, please feel free to type them into the chat. And our moderator, who will be asking her questions, is Mr. Eugene Spiro. And let me introduce you to him. Dean Spiro has over 25 years of international development experience, managing and evaluating projects with a focus on capacity strengthening, private sector development, and corporate governance. Jean is currently serving as an acceleration director for USAID's Partnerships Incubator, a $14 million global service hub established to expand and diversify USAID's partner base, catalyze innovations, and implement best practices. Recently, as technical advisor with Chemonics International, Jean had led a capacity strengthening program for Syria civil defense, the White Helmets. Jean has extensive experience as a consultant with UNDP, including co-authoring UNDP's corporate strategy for partnership with international financial institutions, supporting gender-sensitive budgeting in Haiti, assessing support for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises to survive the COVID-19 pandemic in Malaysia, and various country-level assignments to Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Turkmenistan. In Ukraine, Jean prepared a strategy to support civil society organizations in the areas of anti-corruption reforms and grassroots engagement in public governance. He has led business enabling environment projects in Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, led an advisory program for the Hungarian Ministry of Finance, facilitating venture capital investment, has worked with teams preparing evaluations of USAID administered enterprise funds in Central and Eastern Europe, Egypt, and Tunisia, and oversaw a corporate governance reform program in Southeast Asia with the International Finance Corporation. Jean began his career at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Jean's experience includes the private sector in private banking and academia. He is currently serving as an adjunct professor at the Bay Atlantic University's MBA program in Washington, D.C. Jean holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in International Studies and a Master of Arts degree in International Economics from the American University in Washington, D.C. He is fluent in French and Hungarian.
Georgine, thank you. I think it's over to me. That
Yes.
bio, I appreciate your conveying that information. That bio was way too long. I should have made it much shorter. I'm taking time away from Zuzana and our audience in the Q&A. But thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much for the introduction and the welcome, Georgine, Zuzana. Likewise, thank you for the opportunity to join you today. My role here is to help move the conversation along with Zuzana. We have some questions that we can share with Zuzana for discussion, and I'll be keeping an eye on our chat box to see or to facilitate and communicate questions that are coming in from the audience. Zuzana, so great to hear your opening remarks. You covered a lot of territory there. You also touched on a couple of points that I can very much relate to. First of all, thank you. You made reference in the early days to the support that came from the United States to civil society in Slovakia, and I was part of that, not part of that motivation, but I hopefully contributed a little bit to it. That's what first brought me to work and live in Central and Eastern Europe with the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is affiliated with the National Endowment for Democracy. We did some work with USAID. Subsequently, I worked with the East-West Institute in the region. A lot of this support, as you point out, came from the States. You then talked about the transition and the development in Slovakia, domestically, of philanthropic dynamics. You mentioned crowdfunding. It made me think of impact investing and the sort of overall trend globally, really, towards the intersection of social objectives and goals and private sector activity, and how those two have joined in bringing forward social goals. You then pointed out that there are some drawbacks in the funding architecture these days with civil society in Slovakia as elsewhere. Some sustainability questions. That's something that I'm very much working on these days with the incubator, as was mentioned. You mentioned corporate interests. CSR comes into play here, again, touching on private sector interests. Hopefully those are genuine. Sometimes we wish that they would be a little bit more genuine than they are. But as you correctly pointed out, there are some vulnerabilities there that we have to be vigilant to. And then you talked about the sort of general and very real disillusionment among the populace, again, in Slovakia and elsewhere, my own country, the United States. a lot of distrust that's been growing with regard to institutions that traditionally have been very much trusted, and now there's a lot of questions and a lot of challenges to institutional, to the governance of institutions and the role they play in keeping society going. Just a quick recap, because you raised so many interesting points. I tried to summarize. I'm going to watch for questions, but I can start with one, if I may, Zuzana, that I would ask you if you would delve a little bit with us into the story of Slovak civil society, talk a little bit more about the roots, where it came from, the role of dissidents from the previous era, from the communist era, in bringing about changes and dynamics that we saw from the early 90s on. You did make a reference to the role of the United States, but if you could talk a little bit more about the roots there, and then we can progress to a couple of other questions. Thanks.
Sure. As I mentioned very shortly, I believe there is this interesting paradox that when you look at the structure of Slovak economics in the 90s, and people who up till today remain a huge shadow on the Slovak history and economical development, they came from the oligarchic structures of the secret service. Many people who started the businesses in the 90s and influenced the development of Slovakia were actually people who served at with the secret service abroad, and they were the only ones who, through their work, experienced capitalism. And when the communism fell, they were ready to act and to start their own enterprises because they knew what would be coming. And the other people still kind of caught up later. But with the civil society, the paradox is that, of course, the Slovak society was not prepared, and people didn't believe that they can start an initiative, that they can talk to the state as partners, that they can influence legislation. That was unimaginable before. So the only people who were trained for this type of mission were dissidents, who had a long-term history of not only civic education in their closed groups during the communist times, but they also practiced this civic activism already before in much harsher circumstances. When the communist regime collapsed, they were the only ones who were structurally prepared, and luckily who were interested to enter the area of civil society, because if the oligarchs at that time were much more strategic as they are now, I am afraid that they could populate civil society from the very early days. So luckily it didn't happen. And with the help, and I would say that what was really fundamental, as you already mentioned, especially the US realized how important, after this type of paradigm shift in a society, it is to bring know-how to such a country, inspire people, but also provide a backbone. So we could see a rise of institutions. They were founded many times by the dissidents, by the leading figures from the dissident movement, but very soon they were given to future generations. And luckily, a lot of Slovaks jumped into that role. What helped a lot to attract the talent at that time, that the funding structures were long-term, were institutional, so the institutions could develop, and they were also very generous. So what happened is the civil society in the 90s not only attracted interesting talent, but these people were also very well paid for their job. What I think happened at that time was that there was a discrepancy between the payroll of a normal Slovak and a payroll of an NGO activist at that time. And I think the donors started to realize that very soon. Very soon they started to realize that it is necessary, with the economical strengthening of the country and of the region, to pass the responsibility to European Union and to Slovakia. And that happened. Many organizations downsized in that era. many people who in the 90s grew through experience and through the international exchange, basically went to politics and to other areas of life. But at that time, I think the infrastructure was still very strong. What came as a huge challenge was actually after the EU accession.
It's two observations. One, thank you for that. Two observations. One is that sometimes we see, as you mentioned, oligarchs luckily kind of stayed out of that picture at that time, right? Sometimes we do see the reverse happening, though, maybe more these days, that, if I may say bluntly, in order to burnish credentials, sometimes you have people getting into the civil society space in order to present a good side to the public. I wonder if you think that there is a risk to a dilution in that sort of situation to the good profile, to the positive profile of civil society. I'm not saying that's happening in Slovakia. I don't know, actually. I've seen it in other countries, but I'm wondering if that may be a feature of the dynamic in Slovakia, and if you think that may have anything to do with the disillusionment that you then also referred to with regard to civil society.
Yeah, I think this is one of the risk factors. I think what some people saw with many successes of civil society, who was really able to mobilize Slovak public in the defense in the key moments, but also brought incredibly inspiring leaders who were able to continue in politics and other spheres. I don't have to mention many examples. Zuzana Čaputová, our president, is only one of them. And many people observed that prominent role the civil society leaders had in the society, and started to enter the civil society with not very healthy motivation or very good motivation. They did it for political purposes. So I think this is one thing that damaged the credentials of a civil society to a small extent, but only to a small extent. I think what more happened, and I don't think this was intentional or this was driven with bad intent, but civil society really focused on democratic rooting and grounding in Slovakia on the huge structural fights, where you know that you have to influence legislature, that you have to establish institutions, that you have to focus on really be able to be equal partner with politics and with the state. And you have to do advocacy, you have to do a very specific roles, involving legal advice, IT literacy, being able to talk to and have a systemic PR, run a systemic PR campaigns, marketing, etc. And I think what happened is that we stayed very active in the urban areas and in the high level fights. But what the civil society has not been mentioning and representing well was the grassroots population that was living in secluded areas, in areas that were economically not doing so well. And these people didn't meet on the ground anybody from the civil society outside of those, as you mentioned, those mobilization efforts grounded around the key elections. But in the meantime, we fought. I was an anti-corruption activist and a journalist for a long time, and I was really genuinely believing that I was representing people in the fight, to protect public resources. But after some time, when the first populist and extremist parties came to rise, represented mainly with Mr. Kotleba, we were caught by surprise. And I was really surprised that under the radar, in the landscape of alternative media and small villages, the grassroots movement grew that we didn't see because it was a very low cost, very marginal movement to a certain point, which was kind of gaining ground, and which was using our narratives to basically implement ideas into people that the system is wrong and is corrupt and it needs to be destroyed and it needs to be replaced, not reformed but replaced. And because we were naturally felt like people who represented transparency and trying to objectivize how we run the state and how we run politics, we were of course seen as enemies. So this underground movement very organically joined with the Russian propaganda, trying to destabilize the whole region and try to portray us as foreign agents who are supported by Mr. Soros and who are here to basically threaten the Slovak nationalism. And this narrative became larger and larger. And I think today, unfortunately, most of the Slovak parliament is populated by political parties who don't have very strong internal democratic infrastructure and who are not traditional, but they are based by these ad hoc groups that really wanted to have a very quick access to power, and they don't pay systemic attention to the reform of the state. So what is happening is really dismantling of all the key spheres and areas in the Slovak society. And unfortunately, I think even more critical than the civil society that will be important is if we are able to reform political parties and if we are able to reestablish a healthy ecosystem of strong, institutionally strong, sustainable political parties who are democratically rooted and oriented. But I don't know if I answered your question right.
You did, and in so doing, you raised 3 new questions. That's always the risk, isn't it? And I'm going to share them with you, but I'm just looking to see. I encourage the audience to send questions because we do, of course, want to hear from our listening audience and cover territory that is of interest to them. I guess the first question that comes to mind is: it sounds like there is a linkage that we can see between trends that are happening in the political sphere. I guess I'm talking about extremism, to use that word, or hardening, or rigid opinions, or moves away from the center. Again, in many countries like the States as well, but in this case, Slovakia, we're talking about, with perhaps what we might define as, or what we might view as less, on balance, am I correct? Less respect for traditional opinions or traditional respect for democratic traditions, and that has a spillover effect onto civil society, or civil society might get hijacked in a way and pulled up into this sort of confusing scenario. I would have to wonder, though, then, why isn't it the case that civil society's legitimacy actually increases or enhances in a situation like this as the guardian of, whatever we think of as a stable, sustainable, peaceful, moderate, progressive society, if we're not finding that in the political sphere, if we're not finding that among political parties who might be governed by short-termism or opportunism? Too bad that that's not being found in the civil society sector. It seems to be not the case. Do I have that right? And if so, why would that be? Civil society should be filling gaps that are left open by the state or by politics, as you mentioned in the case of COVID, for example, stepping in. And this happens all over the world, right? Civil society plays that role, filling gaps where the state is deficient. So if you look at this as a deficiency in the state now, these political trends, why is civil society not filling that gap?
I think genuinely that civil society is filling the gap. We can really see that over the years, and also talking from my experience in the years of defense of basic rule of law infrastructure and trying to dismantle the corrupt oligarchic network. What civil society learned is to really build very strategic partnerships. And I see that there is Todd Sedgwick in the audience, who was an ambassador, U.S. ambassador in Slovakia at the time, and he was one of the key ambassadors in the crowd who very unprecedentedly joined with the businesses and civil society, and, for example, started to monitor harassing disciplinary hearings against judges who the oligarchic structures tried to put aside. So civil society at that time built very strategic partnerships and started a trusted network with key players from other sectors, including businesses. And what we can see now, that from these partnerships, thanks to the ambassadorial support at that time, that was mitigating the first contact between civil society and businesses, who were very cautious of each other, started strategic partnerships that are lasting up to this day. So when I mentioned, for example, the key efforts that happened during the COVID pandemic and after the Russian aggression in Ukraine, in Slovakia, the biggest platforms that were collecting money and humanitarian support and organizing help to refugees and to people affected by COVID, those were run in the very close partnership of leading business figures who became major philanthropists, but who also brought their own talents and their own resources into this sphere and really increase the impact of civil society. So there are a huge parts of civil society who are filling the gaps and who are trying to provide services and provide innovative solutions. What I think and fear is that people are getting more and more tired, and if we don't fix this gap of institutional funding, and if we don't convince the local donors, because there are some philanthropists who get the point, but it's not on a large of a scale enough. But if we don't convince the local corporate foundations and the big players who have the resources and money, that they should really focus not only on marketing-based philanthropy that is too much tied to their own goals and to short-term projects. And if they don't understand the need of institutional funding, I think that the civil society will get weaker over time. I mean the progressive or the pro-democratic civil society, because the picture is mixed. And I will say maybe something a little bit controversial, but I think it's to a certain extent logical what is happening, because the shift from communism to democracy was really unprecedented, and it was a paradigm shift combined with the global trends that are really unprecedented as well. We are on the verge, like we just experienced the biggest informational revolution since the invention of the printing press. And I think logically also, when you look back in that time, the historians agree that the disruption that came after the invention of the printing press took some time for the society to cope with the new powers and with the new informational ecosystem. And I think that through the social networks and the new platforms, we are living in the times where it is our task now to deal with the new powers and the new responsibilities coming with the fact that the information can flow so quickly and so freely, and anyone can become an influencer and get a stage. So this is logical, but also with the globalization and complexity of the world, I think many people logically feel left behind. They are not part of this economic urban success. So it is very logical that there are part of the groups of people who are very confused and who feel that what has been driving the globalization and economy and innovation was a world that was maybe too liberal and too far-fetched from traditional kind of values that they knew and they experienced, and I think it's very logical. And they started to, because they were overheard for such a long time and they were not part of the success, I think what they learned is to use the same tools as the civil society who defended democracy in the first place. And they became very successful in that. And they used the whole framework that was available for them. You know, social networks, very cheap ways how to organize, very cheap ways how to reach audiences and establish media with almost zero money. So they basically are another generation of civic activists using the same tools, but only for purposes we are not so happy with, and the purposes that can destroy democracy. And unfortunately, I think the world in the history experienced these rebellions many times, and it's a logical outcome of certain needs not to be met for a long time, or certain voices to be neglected. And I think we need to find a way how to reinvent democracy and make it understandable and workable for everyone. And in this sphere, I must say, also looking back at I must say very openly, looking back, I was focused so much on anti-corruption, rule of law, and really believing that this will set this cornerstone for Slovakia. But to be honest, people couldn't hear me very much as a known figure in Slovakia talking about structural poorness, you know, and where it comes from. About the problems of people who are socially weak, about all those families who live without their mothers because they can't find work and they have to go abroad to Germany or Austria to be caretakers of elderly people there. So there are many problems that of a majoritarian population that have been overlooked here, and people didn't feel represented, and they took it in their own hands, and now they are pouring out their aggression. And we need to learn how to debate together and how to, you know, consolidate the society in a way that it will work for all of us, I would say.
And these are some of the people who may not view themselves as winners in the context of globalization, and that was this huge dynamic and this force, this wave that carried everybody, and some got carried one way and some got carried in another. And as you point out, with regard to the tools of communication, advocacy can work in more than one way. Yeah, advocacy can do what we think it ought to do, but it can also do things that we may not think it ought to do. I'm watching for questions from our audience, and I'm not seeing anything. I hope I'm using my communication tool here.
I see some
you do?
question marks. I see some question marks, that I don't see questions typed. So I hope we don't have a technical problem.
I hope so as well. I hope we're not missing any questions from audience, but I'm not seeing anything. So audience, please, if you have questions, go ahead and enter them in the chat. I'm trying to watch for this. I think we probably have time. Maybe actually, having said that, not too much time left. Unfortunately, time flies, doesn't it? Okay, Zuzana, then maybe I'll ask the classic question as we possibly are approaching the end of our conversation, unfortunately, so quickly. What of the future? Do you have any thoughts, any sort of headlines of where civil society in Slovakia might be going or could be going? Are there successes that it can build on? We talked about some of the vulnerabilities, maybe some of the gaps. Surely there are strengths. And as with most things, if we build on strengths, then that might be a good place to start. Do you see any directions or areas or sectors or thematic areas? Importantly, also with a view, as you've pointed out, to the need for society always, maybe in particular now, to have sustainability high on its agenda. And there we can talk about funding as a very practical matter, or the role of the corporate sector, corporate interests. I was going to say, there's hope. Maybe I can help get started. For one thing, the corporate world, I think it's fair to say worldwide, this is no surprise, paying attention to what we call ESG, right? Environment, social governance. So as that sort of priority feeds its way into boardrooms and the governance of corporations, maybe that's something that helps our cause. And the second thing I will say is I think there's an awful lot of hope in the next generation, in youth, because people who are now in their 20s and 30s are, I think, very, very civic minded. Again, of course, there's a range of opinions, obviously, but there is an awful lot of attention being paid towards civic and social concerns among the younger generation, probably a lot more than when I was in my 20s or 30s. Anyway, I'll sort of offer those as 2 points of hope, but Zuzana, your thoughts on what do we have to look forward to? Thank you.
I must say this is a question for a Nobel Prize. I have the feeling that not only in Slovakia but globally, you know, with so many tensions rising, whoever can guess what will happen can win a Nobel Prize, and nobody really knows. What I am an optimist, so I really see that every crisis is an opportunity and is a fair picture of the state of society. So every crisis makes the overlooked problems to come to the surface much more and helps us to face them directly. So this is how I see the current challenges as well. You know, as you pointed out, we lived through Mature times, we lived through communism, and we see that the society survived, reinvented itself, and I believe that that we will do the same now. And I must say that what brings me a lot of hope is that I feel you know, many very healthy traits, like with the challenges that came to Slovakia, like for example with the war in Ukraine being so close, the political representation, as fragmented and as difficult as it might be, but we were sending the mix to Ukraine. We were sending the S-300, the defense system, as one of the first countries, which would be unexpected. Well, you know, when you look at the polls of such a high Russian propaganda kind of narratives surfacing in the civil society, and so much support, so much pro-Russian support, which is shocking. You would never think that the political representation would take such daring steps. You would never guess that the civil society would be so willing to mobilize, and when the state was not ready to offer any help to the refugees in the first weeks and months, the civil society really, you know, the statistics say that it collected in the first few months more than 15 million euros, mobilized more than 15,000 volunteers, collected 8 tons of humanitarian aid. So the scale was really unprecedented, and I think I hope that that this will happen with all the other challenges I mentioned. I think the life itself will push us to manage the polarization, and maybe we need to experience crisis that you know, I looked through the long form that was published by The Economist, who looked back into the 16th century or 17th century, tracking all the humanitarian catastrophes and pandemics and wars, and after every one a political crisis came. So it seems that maybe that it's inevitable that that after such a dramatic crisis, a problem comes, but it helps to mobilize the society. So I hope we will find the answers along the way.
Some very inspiring points that you raised. Thank you, Zuzana. I asked you a very impossible question, as you said, but thank you so much. You put some very good markers out there for consideration. I think we're more or less approaching time here. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
And Georgine, Zuzana, these may have been appropriate, sort of moving in the direction of closing remarks. I don't know if you have anything else you would like to add now, Zuzana, in closing our conversation. Thank you so much.
I see that there is one question, what things might happen to Slovak civil society after the September elections. So I don't want to ignore it.
Right.
I think what probably is appropriate to mention is that nobody knows. I think that there will be a lot of efforts in the civil society to prevent the worst happening, because I think many people are scared that the oligarchic state capture can come back with a very fierce force, which would be very motivated to go and move Slovakia the Orban way, the way of Hungary and Viktor Orban, and we understand this threat. I think what is very difficult, it seems that the polls are showing that 40% of Slovak adults are disillusioned and are not willing to vote for anyone, and or to put their trust into anyone. So the only possible ways for mobilizations are young people, which makes it, I think, a little bit harder. So nobody knows. But as I said, we have survived many critical moments throughout the history, and every of these moments helped to bring back the good in the civil society and mobilize the most positive traits. And I think that Slovakia is now very well internationally grounded. It is dependent on cooperation with its partners in the West. So let's hope that Europe will also do its own homework and not fall apart. Let's hope that the kind of reinvented NATO alliance and transatlantic unity and democratic unity will not fall apart. We've seen how easily it can be damaged with Mr. Macron visiting China this week. So let's hope that our leaders will really realize the responsibility that lies in their hands. But I think, and many thanks to a conversation like this that we are holding on many levels and many fronts, I think the constituency and the community of people who cares and the possibilities of collaboration are unprecedented. The networks that were created and the trust formed in the past, it all is, I think, a wonderful seed for these type of challenges. So I hope we will surprise ourselves with the best. And many thanks, Eugene, for such a wonderful moderation, and Georgine and Friends of Slovakia for this invitation. And yeah, I hope that we remain all optimistic for the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And thank you all for coming. And I wish everyone a good day.
Good day, everyone.
And good evening for us. And
good evening.